So that's not really a clear defining line. There is, however, an additional difficulty with moral incentives, namely, all countries have tried it. All countries, let me be more exact, with genuine social revolutions have tried it. Russians have tried it, Cubans, Yugoslavs, Chinese. Only some revolutions occurred earlier and some revolutions later, and everybody eventually had the same experience, and the experience is the following one. First, you may have very inadequate distribution of either awards of material, monetary nature or non-material nature. You may abuse your position in the monetary market, or you may abuse your position in non-material sphere by your connections, relatives, and so on. So you get medals even if you really don't deserve them. So there is nothing to control the immorality or abuse in the income distribution this way or that way. The second point is that material incentives somehow leave you a greater scope for objective treatment than non-material. In other words, the non-material incentives make it really necessary for administrative organization to be strengthened and to become more rigid. And what is the net result of that is that you gradually, without being aware of that, curtail some of the pretty important freedom of human beings. You realized, for instance, that people just don't go to the jobs that have to be filled. So what do? You send them by administrative fiat there. If the students after graduation don't want to go to the province, what the government does is just to compel the student to go where he is sent to go. So the initially noble idea of getting rid of selfishness and greed and so on by a wrong application and all sorts of confused ideas about incentives eventually lead you to suppress some of the freedoms that were already available and possible. You may take the case of Cuba, which is perhaps the best known, and they perhaps went harder than anybody else. They had to pass a law, I think it was in 71, against about 400,000 lazy people who would then be, people who refused to work, who would be sent to rehabilitation centers and compelled to work. Now, if you can't avoid this sort of measure, then there is nothing you can do. But if you can avoid it by designing, say, proper wage differentials, you should do it. Because you begin by sending lazy people to rehabilitation centers, and you end up by sending the opponents of the regime to Gulag Archipelago. And there is a third element in that, namely that it seems that the monetary incentives simply work better. I would tend to think that the economic failure of Cuban experiment, as you may know, in the first decade, they had zero or negative rate of growth, while all other countries were growing rather fast. This negative economic result has a lot to do with this confused idea about incentives. And it's not a matter of chance that they had gradually to abandon it, and then now they introduce other schemes. Now let me end by saying, in social affairs, you can't hope for perfection. The best way to destroy the achievements of the revolution is to insist on perfection. So what you do is to try to design your system in order to minimize the evils. And that's the way how the society progresses. You look dissatisfied.
Yes, I'm dissatisfied because you still haven't answered then how are you talked about the transition from capitalism to
Oh,
socialism.
well, I'm
How-
sorry, I forgot
how
that.
do you create it so that people don't have monetary incentives working the best so you can get that transition onto communism?
As you may know, the most popular idea about transition is violent revolution. And it's again one of those ideas that imply are mechanical continuation of what our forefathers said about socialism 150 years ago, in conditions were completely different. And then people don't realize that both Marx and Engels changed their opinions about that by the end of their life. Not because they changed, but because situation changed. However, I can't go into that. I only wish to say that the current idea of radical movements, more often than not, is that all you have to do is to engineer revolution. You sweep away all the barriers. You fire Rockefellers and you destroy the governmental apparatus, and then you begin your educational process. And this is what Russians did, didn't they? With very noble people, very able people, and what was the result? Did they educate new people? You just have to talk to Russians themselves if you can find friends among them, and you normally don't in Russia because they are so afraid that they just won't talk to you. I personally had a lot of experience. I may tell you long stories about that because I've been to Russia, I speak Russian, and I have Russian friends. So this is really not the way you would like to do it. If violent revolution is forced upon you, then of course you resist. You won't tolerate you being suppressed. That's pretty obvious. But if you can avoid it, you should do it by all means, because that's in the interest of socialism. Now, how you do then go about transformation? Let me try to give you a hint by an imaginary sort of what economists would call thought experiment. Suppose we are not now in 20th century, we are now in 15th century, the time when Thomas Morus was active and Campanella and these utopians. We live in feudalism, but we have a knowledge of all that happened later on. And we would like to speed up the destruction of feudalism and the building of capitalism because we believe capitalism is a good system, as French revolutionaries did, or as your founding fathers did, as most of people in this country still believe. So what would be the appropriate tactics or strategy in the 15th and 16th century in order to speed up capitalist development? To engineer a peasant war against the feudal lords. We had a number of peasant wars in Europe, and all but two, to my knowledge, and I'm not a perfect historian, so I might be wrong, but so far as I could make out, all but two failed, and those two that didn't fail didn't succeed either. One is in Sweden, where the leader after success was killed, and so we don't know what would have happened if he survived. And the other one was in Bulgaria, where the peasant leader, peasant himself, was successful, and his armies defeated the king's armies, and he killed the king. And you know what he did? He married the wife of the king and made himself a king. And since then, more or less, the same thing has been happening after every successful violent revolution. So this is not the thing you would like to do. What you would like to do, if you were a serious social scientist and had this privilege of knowing what was going to happen, is to find out what the fundamental social institution of this new system is. and you would try to create situation and conditions under which this institution could be transplanted in a way into your present society. And you would then leave it to the work of that institution to corrode the society and destroy it from within. But by destroying it, it will immediately, at the same time, simultaneously create conditions for replacing this society by the new society to which this institution really belongs. And from the perspective of the feudal society, which is the fundamental institution of capitalism that you would like to introduce? Any suggestion?
What institution would you work on in feudalism? So far, it sounds like you're just saying you don't have to worry about it, right? That the conditions will create itself and you're working out contradictions.
Oh, they will, but it will take a long time. And you don't live that long, so I would like to speed up the process. They did, after all. We witnessed that. We find this in historical textbooks. You know, feudalism was destroyed, but it took a couple of centuries. If you wanted to speed up the process, which is the capitalist institution you would like to see developed in feudalism? That's another mistake socialists make. I'll come to that. No reason why they shouldn't be comparable. It's money and market. You just organize market, introduce money economy, and you destroy feudalism.
So what would you say, you know, supposedly we were supposed to be talking about socialism and communism, right?
No, we are still not that far. We are still in capitalism.
That was my question. Because
I'll come to that. But we first have to reach socialism. So what you do in capitalism is revolution is no good unless it's forced on you. Then you have no choice. You have to fight, as I did. And that's which gives me sort of some sort of competence on judging on that, because I don't read about revolution from the books. I participated in it, and if I could avoid it, I would have done that. And I believe all my colleagues would feel the same. So if you like to avoid the revolution, what you really should do, you should again to pick up such an institution which is comparable to money and market in capitalism. Now, which is this institution? The institution that somehow personifies socialism, that makes it a distinctly different system. It must again be some sort of basic organizational principle, because market is nothing else but an organizational principle of the society. Well, I would submit it's self-management. It's the elimination of hierarchy. So suppose you are able to convince unions and to enlighten workers that you really don't need bosses, you don't need the boards of directors, they don't perform any function. And since they are functionless, they are not legitimate. And so the workers begin to think in these terms. They don't think in these terms now because no one tells them that. And they are not that educated that they could find it out. They'll find out that through struggle and strikes and fights and general strikes and occurrences like '68 in France, where suddenly they realized that's the way, but then they were suppressed. And among other things, they were suppressed because the Communist Party told them that was not the way. So, you know, they so-called revolution. Students, people in services, hospitals.
It's not really physical, though, when you think
you must make an assumption before you go ahead, and then you examine your assumption. I am willing to go also with you and see how you do it, how you achieve that. But suppose you do that, and there are pressures in this direction, and gradually becomes more and more clear that the whole management theory about line and stuff and hierarchy and so on is a fake. It's nothing real. And mind you, you already have books in this country on that, and not by communists or Marxists or, radicals. There is a book by a former colonel from Pentagon named Thayer. I would strongly suggest, if you are interested in the matter, to read the book. It's called The End of Hierarchy. He very clearly perceived what's the way to go beyond this society. He is very confused and very wrong when he comes to practical suggestions. But his diagnosis is very correct one. So if such people already begin to think along those lines, it's already in the air. Now, once this happens, the whole capitalist structure will crumble, because the entire system rests on the assumption that you need bosses and you need hierarchy. And once you begin to eliminate that, you just can't afford to have the management with the income differentials, with interest groups in the Congress, with the two-party system, with party bosses. All these things suddenly become obsolete and functionless.
And how do you deal with all the repressive forces that the state has at its command?
Repressive forces can work only as long as they are accepted as legitimate by a majority of people, or by at least substantial segment of people. If the doubt is sown about the legitimacy, there is nothing they can do anymore. You just study the revolutions, how they occurred, and they occurred exactly at the point where the ruling class was unable to control the repressive apparatus anymore, and they just give up. The Russian Revolution was really a very peaceful revolution. Only few people were killed at the day of revolution. What was not peaceful was the intervention from outside, and that made it bloody. They would be able to do that were it not, Germans at their frontier, and Germans marched in, and they had to use the Red Army to go there, and all sorts of things like that. If they were left to themselves, it would have been rather peaceful. Yeah.
It seems to me that there are some indications that this may not be the case. For example, one historical indication in the case of Chile, in the case of the French uprising in '68. I think we could list others, but that's enough maybe. Where in fact the repressive apparatus have represented a very small group within the society and have nevertheless succeeded because they had the gun. Because the state has succeeded in creating a caste apart from the society which would obey them regardless of their social ties, in the case of Chile. And you had outside help. We can look at it another way, in that, what do you replace hierarchy with in a large organization? It seems to me you have to replace it with some kind of information network. There's at least centrality. Somebody knows what's going on all around the network in order to orchestrate the operation, correct? But that person is also the one who controls the reward, before you're back to a certain kind of hierarchy.
So you see, you gave a very good example of why revolution can't succeed in this country. Because even being in favor of reforms, you doubt that they can be carried out. And you doubt because you are not informed, and you can't be informed because no one works on that in this country.
Well, I know that our food co-op is not going to start a revolution or carry it through peacefully.
That's another example. Food cooperatives have nothing to do with self-management or socialism. But we can't go into details. I just wanted to point out how great this gap of misunderstanding is, and that's why we are so unsuccessful. Yeah.
Well, like you mentioned that some officers in the U.S. Army have proposed self-management, but I've seen plans for proposals for self-management for European countries like Britain. And like in most cases, like the type of self-management they talk about is like giving workers like control over minor affairs. And the control over like major decisions like investment and wages and things like that remain with like the managerial elite.
Correct.
So like, I would question, like that, I just don't see how you're gonna go from, like giving workers control over like minor affairs to like giving workers control over everything. And to me, like, it seems that at that step, people like the Rockefellers and like the managers of the corporations and their allies in the armies aren't gonna go for that. And that at that step, that's where the line's gonna be drawn. And that you are gonna have to have some sort of like uprising to go beyond that. And I think that the example you showed is a very good one.
No, it's a very bad example. If you wish, we may talk about it, because I happen to be in Chile. I was teaching there. I have a lot of friends there, and just recently I was briefed on the whole affair by the most competent man there exists in Chile, and that's Radomiro Tomic, who happens to be in Washington. So I think I'm well informed about Chile, and I may give an explanation if there is time later on. Chile is just completely opposite. It's an example of what you shouldn't do. They are responsible for their failures. But the question you raised was another one, when I said correct. That was, about Britain. Now, British society is not exactly the most quickly changing society in the world. So you would not expect dramatic changes to occur there overnight. And what you quoted is good description. That's not self-management. And they don't call it self-management. They call it joint consultation. And the more ironically minded workers call it toilet democracy. So again, that has nothing to do with self-management. But what has something to do with self-management is the fact that what until recently was considered so-called prerogatives of the management. The unions can argue about wages and that's it, but the management makes decision. Now, once you introduce joint consultation, management still makes a decision, but it has to consult workers. This idea of management prerogatives being something untouchable has been destroyed. And once the process of corrosion is initiated, there is nothing to stop it. The next step is what Germans have done, co-determination, with certain decisions already being made by workers. They have this personnel director in the board of directors, and certain decisions are made by workers only, and so on and so forth. So what you would then expect to happen is to move from one stage to the other. And there is no necessity for violent revolution. It won't speed up this movement of stages if you are not aware of the possibilities.
But I mean, I disagree when you say that once a process of corrosion is started, it can't be stopped. I think the examples of U.S. unions are...
Of what?
U.S. unions, trade unions in the U.S. Like, they started gaining power like about 30 or 40 years ago. And like they seem to be moving towards like greater, toward fights of, attaining greater power for U.S. workers. And the fact is that they were stopped. Like the workers...
You are again correct in your description. But when did any union boss profess his belief in self-management? They always believed in hierarchy.
A lot of communist members of unions and...
When did communist members of unions believe in self-management?
I think in the 30s. Well, I mean...
Never.
Maybe not self-management.
That's different.
They were killed.
Okay.
That's very different.
They were driven out of unions, and they were persecuted and, driven out.
Wobblers did. That's true. But it's also true that Wobblers believed in violent revolution, and that killed them.
No,
Violence, I
they
read that
killed
was
him.
mostly visited by the
No, you know the history of wobblers. They were mostly connected with unskilled workers, the immigrant workers, and in the mines and so on. And the conditions there were really so rough that they couldn't behave differently but violently. The strikes at that time were warfares. But it's simply unfortunate. They were associated with this sort of behavior, and they became violent themselves, and it killed them, because no society will tolerate violence if it can control it at all. And they really never had seriously developed social theory. You know, it was a spontaneous, and you can't do it. Socialism is too serious an affair that you can possibly try it out on an experimental basis. You know, you've got to be more serious than that. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to change the topic a little bit. Now, based on your criteria, how close or how far is People's Republic of China from socialism? Same question for Yugoslavia.
I can't answer you about China
From an economist point of view.
from no point of view, because society is an integrated whole, so you can't answer about one aspect without knowing the other aspects. And I can't answer your question on China because I don't speak Chinese, I don't read Chinese, I've never been in China, and I don't believe people who come from China after 3 weeks that what they saw is properly interpreted. I believe them that what they tell me is what they saw, but the interpretation may be widely incorrect. And I know that from my own experience when we carried out revolutions, and we would get young, promising, ambitious American students and so on coming to Yugoslavia, and from the questions they asked, I used to be in position, we used to have youth actions, building railways and roads and so on after the revolution. And I knew a couple of languages, so they sent me to the headquarters to deal with these naive foreigners. And from the questions they asked, I realized that they were impossible, you know. Just couldn't understand what was going on, however well-intended they were. So to make it short, I just don't feel competent to talk about China, although I accumulated a lot of evidence, and I have friends who've been there, and I discussed the matter, still don't feel competent. Now about Yugoslavia. Here the things are equally incomprehensible for foreigners, but at least I feel competent to discuss them. Here you have this self-management basis, more or less, fully built up in economy and services and offices and so on in this, you may call it, productive sector of the society. But it's widely lacking, not completely lacking, but widely lacking in the political superstructure. And so you have two different organizational principles being applied to the same society. Full participation in one sphere and a sort of Leninist, Stalinist, old social democratic centralist doctrine of so-called democratic centralism, which really means that the leadership decides and everybody else implements this here. And at the moment, this is the situation of the country, and therefore the country is a bad example of what a full-fledged self-managed economy or society would be like. If by any chance the Czech experiment could have survived, then by now we would have had the first test of fully developed socialism. But that was the reason why Russians marched in. Yeah.
Like in Iowa, we have rich cropland, and supposedly our interstate is socialism, and the farm production is self-managed, and another part of the country is rich mine area with poor farming area, and the mining is self-managed. Could you kind of sketch out the structure where those two self for instance, iron for the tractors for the farm and food to feed the miners? How does that work?
It would take me about 2 hours to explain it. But why don't I give you after the lecture the reference? There is a little study of mine that has been translated into English, and you may get hold of it. Yeah.
I'd like to ask a question on the paper you gave. You began by talking about the principle of receiving according to ability, according to work contributed. And the paper developed along the line of how to measure the contribution of work.
Mm-hmm.
Then you switched to another theme, which was the receiving according to the principle of justice. And there doesn't seem to be any relationship between contribution in some sort of work efficiency sense and distribution of income according to a principle of justice. But following on from that, you then assume that the principle of justice will guarantee some sort of equality of income. Yet there are two things that seem to vitiate against this. One is something you raised in the paper itself, which was that you wouldn't necessarily have similar incomes being generated in different industries. So
No. Equal incomes in all industries.
in all industries.
Right.
So even with a system of self-management, you may have equality of income within one firm, but there's no guarantee that there will be equality of income between firms or between industries if total incomes which those firms or industries receive themselves are different. And secondly, drawing on, say from the Yugoslav experience, where you have wide discrepancies of income between the North and the South, my experience is that the states in the North, which are wealthier, are very reluctant to contribute to, say, the social investment fund, which is largely being used for southern development in Macedonia and the southern republics. So there is no seeming self-interest there which guarantees that there will be equality between the various states.
You clearly misunderstood me. Income should be equal industry-wise. If it isn't, then you have exploitation. Then you have transfers from privileged, underprivileged industries to privileged industries, and that cannot be tolerated. But within industry, it may vary from firm to firm, because that's the matter of differential effort expended in various firms. But you were right, I didn't go into one matter, namely connecting the problems of justice with the problems of efficiency. And I just skipped that because there was no time. I may give you a few hints here. The usual approach, neoclassical approach, is to think in terms of efficiency and then allocate your labor and decide on wages and so on. This is really not how the world is organized, either capitalist or socialist. And let me talk about socialist world. What you do is to distribute your income or determine your income differentials, the wage rate, not on the basis of some abstract productive efficiency, but on the basis of many criteria, some of which may not be spelled out rather clearly, which the people in question, the working collective that makes this decision, find to be important. So when they decide that the janitor has to get $5,000 and the director has to get $20,000, and you have 1 to 4 time or rather income span, then this is the basis from which you start. And then you adjust your productive decisions, hiring more janitors or more managers and so on, taking into account this decision as a basic one. You don't look to the market or anything else. It has been decided. Now, why it has been decided? It has been decided because people in question have accepted this to be just decision. What's their concept of justice? It's not your business to worry about. It's their business. You just take it as their decision. All you have to do is to organize your economy now in such a way as to make possible that such decisions are carried out without barriers. And that's the scope of social planning and policy-making authorities and general macroeconomic coordination. In other words, I am sorry if I left you with an impression that socialism means self-management in the firms and laissez-faire market. That's completely wrong. Socialism means basically self-management in the firm because it means abolishing hierarchy, abolishing class distinctions. You can't abolish class distinctions without abolishing hierarchy, without abolishing bosses. But it doesn't mean the elimination of coordination. It only means that you coordinate your activities in a different way, not in a stratified way.
So what you're saying is you really have a type of Langer.
No. Lange is very centralist. No, that was also very naive. All he had to do is to design another neoclassical argument to prove that Hayek and Mises were wrong. And he did that, but he didn't show what's right. Yeah.
Once hierarchy is destroyed in a socialist society, and people take up working, they work and they make their income according to how much work they put into it, then would they also be in control of those the decision-making apparatus, like for of the military and of foreign policy?
Oh, sure.
Then would that call for development of those institutions for human development, human resource development, before you have the work program?
What do you mean by that?
You know, would you have to develop your wait, if you have workers, right, then would you use would you have workers decide on sort, or you know, would they decide to abolish it or whatever they want to do with it? Would they decide it just by being factory workers, or would they have to have more extensive knowledge?
Well, why should only factory workers? Every citizen should participate in decisions of that nature.
Oh, okay. So then you have to come to, okay, then we're going back to the same thing as before. You have to have more than a majority in agreement
Right.
on as many people as possible. But
Right.
then wouldn't it still be like you might still have to dissatisfy the minority?
That's a good question, and this is really the basic problem of socialism. Democracy is no good because democracy, the Western type of democracy, implies hegemony, and enforcing the opinion of majority. In the best of all cases, it means imposing the opinion of the majority upon the minority, but usually it really means minority decides. So that's no good. What you would like to do is to safeguard the rights and interests of minority as well. And one good thing about self-management is that it naturally develops the need and sort of attitude that decisions should be really based, important decisions should really be based on consensus. So consensus is really replacing the majority rule. The problem is, of course, how you achieve consensus. It's not so difficult at the firm level, but the more you move upwards, the larger your constituency becomes, the more difficult it is. But that only tells you that the most important problem, most difficult problem of socialism is not, as Marx believed, and most socialists still believe, economic one. That can be solved rather easily. It's the political one. It's not the distribution of wealth. That can be done overnight. But it's the distribution of political power. And no one, or power in general, and political power being just one aspect of it. And no one has so far found a good approach to that problem. Now let me answer your question, Jan, to the end. You said, well, how do we educate people for communism, for good socialism, and then we go ahead. If you can imagine a society where every individual, from the birth until his death, is, whenever he's associated with the group, and he always is associated with the group, either as a citizen in the neighborhood, or as a worker in the factory, or a student in the university, or anywhere he lives, he is always in a self-governing structure. He always participates in decision making, and he is always aware that other people may have different points of views, and that he has to take that into account. Then you don't need special schools or courses or books of learned people to educate them how they behave. It's the life they live that tells them what the proper behavior is. And clearly the proper behavior cannot be selfishness or egotism or anything of the kind, because that would immediately generate contempt in the group in which he lives. And no sane person can survive by being despised by his fellows. So he'll have to adjust. And the way he adjusts is to get rid of this undesirable traits of his personality that he may have inherited from an earlier system. Now, once this society progresses along these lines and it becomes more and more wealthy in material sense, so that it doesn't really matter very much whether you get somewhat higher or somewhat lower income. All basic needs have been satisfied, or personality building activities are on non-market basis anyway, then you will get what you would like to achieve, or what Fidel tried to do by, governmental fiat. Then people will gradually begin to question the desirability of material incentives generally. What's the meaning of them? Why should you worry so much getting a somewhat higher salary or somewhat lower salary? So the matter of equality, of the final equality, when you can dispense even with this principle of distribution according to work and have this general principle, distribution according to needs, is not a matter of governmental education or a matter of sophisticated, propaganda or anything of the kind. It's a matter of the daily experience of the people. So you have to provide them with the opportunity of personal experience. Yeah.
Please tell us some of your reasons for Chilean failure of the experiment.
Well, unless there are other questions more connected with this country and with the lectures. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, I wanted to ask. And that was, in a country like this, in order to start out, to make a socialist ethic, the people who would start it out would have to have some type of access to a little bit more capital, or to excess capital, or capital to spare.
What?
Otherwise,
Isn't that enough capital around you?
but it's not mine.
Now, why should it be yours?
So she can start the enterprise.
But, see, a group of people, in order to, because like, I remember going back to something you said if somebody in the group wants to do a project, say, takes 10,000 and everybody else, or 15, and everybody else tries to convince them that he only needs 10. Well, you could even use that at a $15 level and reduce it to $10. But you have to have that capital in the group to decide on how you can take it away. And some people may not have the excess capital. You still, in a capitalist society, you still have to donate your money into the means of living, into your means of living.
Look, in a typical U.S. corporation, the management owns less than 1% of the shares. So they don't become managers because of owning the shares. It's completely different principles. Now, if the principles are already different, we may make them even slightly more different and elect management by the employees. So employees will then decide on all these matters and will just give the dividends in the same way as they would repay the obligations or government securities, the fixed interest bearing securities.
Well, see, I was talking about a more real situation because I'm not talking about a corporation. I'm talking about a group of people who might become a corporate group, you know, within themselves. But I'm saying that they would be, in order for them to do it.
That's not the way to change the social system. You should read the attempts in this country in the last century and a half to withdraw from the world, to set up a group in various parts of the country, live according to certain rules, and then after a couple of years, you disintegrate. That's not the way to go around. It's to take the established firms and change them. Yeah.
When you said about all the excess capital that exists in this country, it made me think of another question. Like, to me, part of being socialist is like being concerned with the whole world and everyone in it.
Sure.
And I think both Europeans and Americans have to recognize that a lot of their capital has come from the exploitation of
Sure.
third world countries. And so how would you relate how our standard of living is going to have to differ if we stop exploiting third world countries, and also how your type of management, worker self-management, works for a poor country who still may be semi-feudal, who has to get rid of the exploit. I mean, socialism, Marxism should apply to all countries and not just highly industrial.
Oh, sure. The answer to the question is not a simple or straightforward one. For one simple reason, because outside the boundaries of your own country, you have sovereignty of other countries. And as long as other countries are sovereign, you just can't interfere in their domestic affairs. So, suppose you are aware people are starving in a country, but it has a corrupt government. So what do you do? If you say, okay, we'll help you, we'll develop you, but you change your government, you are immediately accused of, meddling with the affairs of another country. A sort of world planning agency. So all aid transformed in multilateral aid, bilateral aid abolished, and then establish certain rules that would be more or less accepted as international legal rules, and the international court may always serve as a court of appeal. Things of that sort, an agency that would somehow transcend the sovereignty of the nation. But for reasons that are obvious, the powerful nations are not very enthusiastic about a scheme of that sort. Yeah?
I wonder if you could come back to the question that was asked a while ago on the matter of how you get coordination when you deal with a fairly sizable number of people.
No, I must refer you to that study. So after the lecture, I'll give you the reference. Chile? You are all aware of the subversive activities of this government, perhaps other governments in Chile, and the money that was spent. I may give you an illustration from Peru, which is as ominous as it's comical. I spent some time advising Peruvian governments because they expressed serious interest in self-management. Eventually, they passed a law on social property with an intention to introduce self-management as a national system in the country. And at that time, at one point, they had some difficulties, sort of rioting in one of their provinces, and one of the governmental officials told me how their people, their agents, overheard a conversation between two women. One of them was organizing, or among the organizers of that riot, and the slogans usually are, you know, against the undemocratic measures of the government and suppressing this, suppressing that, and things like that. So an uninformed person may think it's really a revolt of people. Now, the dialogue was something like that. The other woman was reproaching this first one of the organizers, why she didn't invite her to participate in the demonstration. And you may again think it's a high level of social consciousness, you know, they wish to participate in demonstration for individual freedoms and so on. But nothing of the kind. She was just angry with the other woman because if she participated, she would get $1 for that. Because everybody who participated in anti-governmental demonstration was getting, I don't know what the price was, $1 or $5, something like that. For a poor Peruvian, that's quite a lot. So we are aware, and I assume the Chilean government should have been aware that this sort of subversive activity would be going on. However, what the Chilean government then had to do, since they were in the minority, was to try to build a political majority in the country. If they intended to carry out the revolution peacefully, as they did, at least Allende did. But what they really did was to have one set of intentions and apply a completely different set of measures, namely measures that were alienating various groups from the government. In the first year, they had a pretty universal support for whatever they did. But then they produced inflation. They gradually lost the authority in handling all sorts of conflicts that occur in every society. They didn't realize they didn't see the actual revolutionary potentials of the people. Let me give you an example. In Chile, already under Frey government, occasionally small enterprises that were about to be bankrupt or were, you know, working with heavy losses and so on, were taken over by the workers. These are the famous tomas, the fabricas. And over the years, over 4 or 5 years, about 100 of such self-managed, workers-managed enterprises were created. And they had their own association, and I met the secretary of that association, a certain man called Victor Arroyo. And this man Arroyo had only primary education and no formal education at all. But by the way he talked, and the way he described his problems of the association, the measures they took and so on, I realized that he was an extremely intelligent person. You know, the approach was as if he had studied the things I studied and my colleagues have written and so on, had no idea of that whatsoever. And I asked them, well, Victor, now you have socialist government, so you should be okay. And he made like that and said, we can't even get money as a credit. Although people are now aware, since we survived 5 years, we'll survive the next 5 years, so we are, you know, in good credit standing. So I said, isn't it true that government nationalized the banks? And say, yes, but that's the trouble, because the government won't give us the money. And so gradually it turned out that the government really disliked that. Not only that they didn't give full support, that they didn't approve it, that they didn't make a, front page story of it. They tried to suppress it. And so did the trade unions. So I asked him whether he was the member of the trade union. And he turned like that and showed me the badge. So I said, why do you hide the badge? And he said, well, we've got to be members, otherwise we would be treated even worse. But there we have really no support from the unions. So the only institution that supported them in Chile at the time of Allende was a cooperative bank. And they did it because they thought that it's really nothing else but producer cooperatives, and it was within the spirit of cooperative movement and so on, and that helped them survive. This is one instance. The second instance is the agricultural cooperatives. They started so-called asentamientos. Already Frey government has carried out agricultural agrarian reform, and Allende government intensified that reform. So there were a number of the states nationalized, and peasants got the opportunity to run their affairs. Again, instead of government helping them to do that and developing this spirit of self-management and participation and so on, they tried to impose governmental inspectors and make them gradually transform into Russian type of kolkhozes and sovkhozes. Now what they did in nationalized enterprises, they built up a huge directorate for all nationalist enterprises. And since there were many of them, this directorate was broken into 4 subdirectorates. And eventually they created a hierarchy of the Russian type. And so in one sector after another, what they did was to apply the Russian solutions, which they hoped will survive in a democratic environment. And that was impossible. You can't have this generally centralist, etatist, if you wish, Stalinist approach on one hand and peaceful transformation on the other hand. The two things don't go together. So you either have to have power, as the Russians did with Red Army, and then you suppress anyone who opposes you, or you have to proceed in a completely different way. And for a completely different way, they simply lacked any social theory whatsoever. They never went beyond the general, central planning, party leading sort of approach. And if you don't have a theory, and if you have a wrong tactics, what's going to be the outcome? Allende, on top of that, was a completely incompetent economist. It was outside his reach, intellectual reach, just no feeling for economics. He was a politician. He was really a genuine politician. Like Fidel. Fidel has no feeling for economics as well. When I was in Cuba, they were confronting extremely serious economic problems. What Fidel used to do was to go to, in the evening or in the night, to the university and meet with third-year students, undergraduate students, and then they would discuss schemes of raising the rabbits in order to provide meat for the population and things like that. So if the leader is incompetent as an economist, if he applies wrong strategy, if he doesn't have any social theory, and I tried really hard in Chile to find out what is the sort of image that Allende and his close colleagues have about socialism. It turned out that they simply have no image. It was, day-to-day affair. It was people's power, something like that. Now, if all these things happen, and you have hostile environment, and you have failures, and they have tremendous failures. Let me give another example. I once spent an evening in a family of communists. She was really a communist activist, and he was a sort of radical, very sympathetic to the government. So I asked the lady, or the comrade, however you wish to call her, what's her opinion of the government? And she said, now, you know, I'm a communist, and I'm for socialism. I'm doing that every day. But I see that the next president will be free. Now, that happened about a year and a half before the coup. At that time, no one was thinking in terms of coup. They just thought there will be chaotic development for the next 3 years, and then they will have normal elections, and then Frey will be re-elected, and that will be the end of it. This is how Chile went about. And I suggest to you, anyone who perhaps has some reservations to my evaluation, if you meet some of the responsible Chileans, and they occasionally come to this country and give talks, and ask him in private about his vision of socialism, you'll be surprised how empty it is. Apart from nationalization, state ownership, and a few things like that, simply does not know what socialism is about. So that's Chile. I may also say that most of my contacts in Chile were really Christian Democrats, because the governmental people were not interested in establishing contacts. They were so, you know, they were in power and they knew all answers to all questions. And one of, perhaps I may say even that, one of the crucial, purely political mistakes was the following one. Allende would not have been elected if the Christian Democrats did not support him. And by Christian Democrats, I really mean the left-wing Christian Democrats, because according to Chilean law, Frey could not be re-elected, so they had to propose another candidate. And the only one they could propose was Tomic, and Tomic was very much left-wing. So he made it conditional. He first rejected it, and then it made it conditional that he'll accept this nomination if they are prepared to go along with left-wing forces in Chile generally. And after a couple of months, he convinced the party, and they gave him his support. And Tomic is a friend of Allende, and they, of course, talked a lot before the elections. And again, they had some sort of gentleman agreement that Tomic will help Allende, but then Allende will establish a sort of working cooperation with Tomic, which meant with the left-wing Social Democrats, which would then include gradually the rest of the party. However, what happened was that when Allende was elected, and he would not have been elected if Tomic acted differently, then the other fellow would go. You know, Allende didn't get the absolute majority, so Congress had to vote. And in Congress, the Christian Democrats were the majority party. So whatever they decided, that candidate would be elected. So it's a fact that the Christian Democrats helped Allende to be elected. Now, the most natural political step in such conditions, if you wish to have a democratic, peaceful transition, would be to try to build up a more or less permanent coalition with the people who helped you to become the president. But the day after Allende's election, he was under such tremendous pressure, not so much by communists as by his own members. You are probably not aware that the Socialist Party, to which Allende belonged, did not want to choose him as a presidential candidate, because they thought he was sort of too mild, too weak, you know, not really for violent, radical, strong measures. But the other one, Altamirano, who was the general secretary and the leader of the majority, was not popular enough in Chile, so if they proposed him, he would not be elected. So Allende was really proposed by his own party because they couldn't avoid him. And so the day after the election, he was under terrible pressure to break all ties with Christian Democrats and to go along with, well, on the basis of the assumption that the development will be such that left-wing Christian Democrats will split from their party and join the Popular Front, and that this will make for a majority.